Louise Thrushwood was a modest, motherly mouse that lived within the walls of a quiet two-story home. If anything could be considered loud in her home, it would be the bellies of her grandchildren, and as the family's food provider, it was her duty to keep them quiet. Each morning, before the sunrise, she would make her way to the house's kitchen to gather crumbs, drippings, and other scraps that had been carelessly left behind by the house's larger residents. This was the Thrushwood way, to take only what was left behind while no one was around to care. The most reward with the smallest risk. It allowed her and her family to live in the house without its residents being any the wiser, and she wouldn't hear any talk of her family being a bunch of thieves. As her father always used to tell her, it's not stealing if no one wants it. Louise had never encountered any of the house's giants, but she knew they were fond of midnight snacking and less fond of cleaning up after themselves. As a result, most of what Louise scavenged consisted of various cheeses, crackers, and cookies, which made up the majority of her family's diet. She would have liked if the housemaster snacked on some more fruits and veggies now and again, but scavengers couldn't be choosers. Wielding her father's sword, which had grown far too dull for combat, she would poke each crumb, inspect it, and place it in her basket if it passed her inspection. That morning, she happened upon something truly special in the midst of rounding up a scattering of cookie crumbs. One of the crumbs in question happened to contain a fully intact chocolate chip, the food of the gods. After sniffing it to confirm it wasn't just a raisin, she held it up to gaze at its shine in the sunlight. She so badly wanted to taste it. It had been months since anyone in her family had even smelled chocolate, but she had to restrain herself. Her father had always warned her about snacking while scavenging. One thoughtless bite could quickly lead to an empty basket, and Louise couldn't bear the thought of her family going hungry because of her. After depositing the final crumb into her basket, Louise sheathed her sword and immediately headed for home. She didn't want to risk sticking around once the housemasters woke up. The less time she spent outside her mouse hole, the better. The Thrushwood home was already full of life by the time Louise returned. The triplets were playing around on the couch. Sophia was hard at work putting her ribbons on everything, and Elizabeth was sulking in the corner practicing her evil stare. Louise's grandkids all threw out a warm welcome upon their grandmother's arrival, though Louise's own kids were a little preoccupied. Adam and Abigail were sleeping like a rock and a log respectively, acting as additional props for Sophia's decorations. Meanwhile, Morgan was already doing the prep work for breakfast. She never was one to take it easy. Louise wanted to keep the little surprise she had found that morning a secret, especially from Morgan. It was difficult enough to convince her to feed her kids the cookie crumbs she scavenged, but Louise understood. It was Morgan's job as the mother to be a stick in the mud, but at the same time, Louise felt it was her duty as a grandmother to spoil her grandkids rotten. As long as she was the scavenger in the house, she'd make sure they got a little sugar in their diet. Louise did wonder how much longer that would be, though. More and more, Morgan had been hinting that Louise should consider retiring her role as the famous scavenger. Louise was already in her mid-50s, and her vision wasn't exactly as sharp as it used to be. Louise could see her point, but every time she thought about hanging up her cape, she'd remember the smiling faces of her little ones every morning she brought in a basket of goodies. It made her feel like she was doing her part, like she was a precious member of the family that couldn't be forgotten like her father was. She had a role to play, and she was the best to play it. Morgan, Adam, and Abigail had only scavenged a handful of times, and they still had a long way to go. Morgan was too cautious and couldn't find enough crumbs to fill her basket. Adam had a tendency to snack on the job, and Abby was too easily distracted by the wonders of the larger house. Louise wanted to see them improve, but she wasn't ready to let go of her title just yet. She knew she had many more adventures left in her. As lively as the Thrushwood household could become, nothing turned it on quite like mealtime. No Thrushwood nose could resist the siren song of the dinner table, especially during breakfast when the crumbs were at their freshest. Even the most tasteless of saltines burst with flavor when placed on a plate with a sprinkle of grandmother love. Unlike the patrons of the larger house, they would not leave one crumb behind. Dropped food would be eaten off the floor without hesitation. To do otherwise would be hypocritical. Louise had melted down the chocolate chip tubes as a topping to the cheese, cracker, and cookie crumbs she'd scavenged in the morning. She played the role of the chocolate fairy, sprinkling a little touch of heaven onto each of their plates. When it came to Morgan's kids, however, it didn't take much in the tank to get their engines running. Davy grabbed his ball from the living room to toss around. Sophia started biting at her food face first like a wild animal, and Abigail suddenly found it difficult to resist teasing her twin brother. They were almost as energetic after eating it as they were just to see it. Even picky little Elizabeth had a chance of joining the Clean Plate Club with chocolate on the table. Louise couldn't begin to measure her joy at seeing the table so alive. Morgan, on the other hand, was on full damage control, striving to quell the storm that was brewing as a result of combining her kids and sugar. She'd never understand why her mother enjoyed causing such chaos. As she attempted to wipe the chocolate off a jittering Sophia's face, Davy threw his ball a little too hard, knocking off Douglas's glasses and flying back into the living room. Dirk was naturally upset with this maneuver, as it was actually his ball, and he didn't like the looks of where it was flying. Morgan chastised Davy for playing around at the dinner table, failing to notice just where that ball was heading. The ball had rolled all the way from the dining room table, across the living room, and out toward the front door. Were the door shut, it would have harmlessly bounced off of it. However, in the excitement of preparing her chocolate topping, Louise had forgotten to close the door behind her. Thus, there was nothing to stop the ball from rolling through the open door and into the untamed wilderness of the larger house. If there was one rule in the Thrushwood house, it was never to leave the safety of the mouse hole after sunrise for any reason. Under Morgan's rules, even looking outside of the mouse hole was grounds for a spanking. It was a rule for the adults as well as the children, though for the adults it was more of a strong suggestion. There was no telling what awaited them out there once the rest of the house was awake, and no, none of them were too keen on finding out. Even so, Davy and Dirk only had the one ball, and it wasn't as though there was a store around for them to buy another. If the larger residents found the ball and took it away, it would be gone forever. Louise volunteered to retrieve it, insisting there was no cause for concern. Their mouse hole had intentionally been dug out far away from any of the large furniture that could conceal predators, and the ball hadn't rolled too far out anyway. Louise was experienced enough to know what she could and couldn't get away with. She hung up her apron and strolled out to retrieve it with a casual "be right back," not even bothering to grab her sword or cape. Morgan was less optimistic about the idea. She wanted to tell her mothers to stop, but Sophia, still high on her sugar rush, cut her off with the unrelenting demand to be read The Legend of Ice Cream again. In truth, Morgan didn't want her boys to lose their favorite toy either. She was just very partial to her grandfather's mantra of no unnecessary risks. At the very least, she wished her mother would put her cape on if she was going outside. She'd die of embarrassment if another mouse family saw her mother like that.